The scan found a machining pattern inside Petrie's old drill core, and the textbook answer immediately ran into trouble. Copper can still be defended. That spiral is harder. For more than a century, the accepted explanation has been familiar. Egyptian workers used copper tube drills, abrasive sand, water, patience, and pressure. The copper did not have to be harder than granite because the grains did the cutting. Then Flinders Petrie's old evidence came back into view. A hard stone core, spiral striations, a groove pattern that appears too regular, too deep, and too aggressive for the simplest tool story. The AI did not solve ancient Egypt. It tested a famous trace against the explanation that has to carry it. And before the core can accuse anything, the old explanation has to go back on the table. The standard model is stronger than many people think. Picture a hollow copper tube pressed against a stone surface. The tube turns by hand power, bow action, or some other controlled motion. Water carries sand beneath the rim. The grains get trapped between metal and stone. Each turn drags those grains across the surface. Slowly, the stone gives way. That is the part that often gets missed. Copper is soft, but in this model, the cutting edge is not copper alone. Quartz sand is harder than copper. Emery, when available, is harder still. Under pressure, those grains become thousands of tiny cutting points. A soft tube can guide a hard abrasive, so the textbook answer is not foolish. It does not ask copper to act like steel. It asks copper to hold its shape long enough for sand, water, and downward force to wear a circular trench into stone. Ancient Egyptian stoneworkers clearly mastered difficult materials. Granite, diorite, basalt, hard limestone, and other stones appear across Old Kingdom monuments, vessels, casing blocks, sarcophagi, and architectural surfaces. The question is not whether they worked hard stone. The objects prove they did. The question is how controlled that work was. In the settled account, the process is slow but possible. Workers keep the tube turning. Fresh abrasive enters the cut. Muddy waste slurry rises or spills out. The hole deepens. A circular core remains inside the hollow tube until it breaks free or is removed. Nothing in that model requires electric motors. Nothing requires a steel drill. Nothing requires an unknown factory hidden behind the pyramid stones. That is why Egyptologists have defended it for so long. It explains a broad class of evidence with tools known from the ancient world. It respects the skill of the craftsman. It does not make the mystery larger than the evidence demands. But the model works best when the question is broad. Could copper and abrasive cut hard stone? Yes, under the right conditions. Could ancient workers drill holes with tubular tools? Experiments have shown they can. Could slurry leave scratches? It can. The trouble begins when one specific core stops being a general example and becomes the measuring instrument. Then the question changes. The old answer must explain not just a hole in stone, but the geometry of a groove wrapped around the core. That is where Petrie matters. Flinders Petrie was not a modern internet voice selling secret history. He was a 19th century surveyor and archaeologist whose reputation was built on measurement. At Giza, he documented stonework with the patience of a man who trusted rulers, angles, notebooks, and error margins more than legends. He worked around the monuments while Egyptology was still hardening into a discipline. The Great Pyramid, the surrounding structures, and the hard stone evidence around Giza were not symbols to him first. They were measured objects. Petrie recorded drill holes. He described tubular drilling. He noted cut cores and the marks left by the drilling process. In hard stone pieces associated with ancient Egyptian work, he saw striations that did not behave like simple random scratches. The disputed object is modest beside the Great Pyramid itself. It is not a hidden chamber under the plateau. It is not a sealed room full of tools. It is a drill core, a piece of stone that survived because a hollow tube cut around it. But the surface of that core carries lines. Some are easy to dismiss. Stone gets damaged. Excavation marks can confuse the record. Abrasive slurry can scratch in unpredictable ways. Later handling can add noise. A single broken line can become a story if the eye wants it badly enough. Petrie's problem was that some marks looked more organized than that. The grooves appeared to wind around the core. They seemed to show a spiral movement. If they were random scratches, they were a curiosity. If they were tool chatter, they were evidence of vibration. If they were a continuous feed mark from a rotating tube advancing into stone, they became something more serious. A feed mark is a mechanical diary. It tells you how far the tool moved downward while it turned. In modern machining, that relationship matters because rotation, pressure, and advance are tied together. Even without a modern machine, the physical question is the same. How much did the cutting tool descend with each turn? Petrie saw enough to record the issue. That is what makes the evidence difficult to wave away. The discomfort does not come from someone centuries later imagining lost technology over a blurry photograph. It comes from a careful observer at the site, writing down a physical trace before the modern argument had hardened around it. The old record is the pressure point, and the automated review begins where Petrie's pencil lines and measurements stopped. The review treats the core as a surface problem first. High-resolution photographs provide the visible texture. Petrie's drawings and published descriptions provide the historical map. The AI workflow does not ask whether ancient Egypt had machines. It asks a narrower question. Which marks behave like isolated scratches and which marks line up as repeated geometry? That distinction matters because a scratch can lie. A scratch can come from a grain dragged sideways. It can come from handling. It can cross another line and fool the eye. But a continuous spiral has obligations. It must keep direction. It must maintain curvature. It must wrap around the core in a way that relates to the shape of the object. The system compares groove spacing, continuity, curvature, and apparent pitch. Pitch is the distance the spiral advances along the core during one turn around the surface. If the line is accidental, pitch should wander without mechanical discipline. If the line reflects tool advance, the pitch may carry a repeated pattern. Petrie's famous observation has often been read by critics as a feed rate problem. Some later arguments point to a descent sometimes discussed around 1/10 of an inch per revolution in the hardest material, depending on which mark and interpretation are being used. That number is why the dispute refuses to die. 1/10 of an inch sounds small until you place it inside a hard stone drilling operation. If a copper tube and loose abrasive are cutting granite, every fraction of advance has to be earned by pressure, grit, rotation, and removal of waste. A steady spiral implying rapid descent would not simply say the stone was cut. It would say the tool was being controlled with unusual efficiency. The AI flags the regularity. It does not name a motive. It does not identify a motor. It does not prove a lost workshop behind the pyramid. It isolates the pattern that the old model must answer. That is the proper pressure. If the spiral is a true feed mark, the copper and sand explanation has to carry more weight. It must explain the abrasive quality, the downward load, the stability of the rotating tube, the removal of slurry, and the ability to keep the cut consistent while the core remained inside the tool. If the spiral is not a feed mark, then the model has less trouble. But that answer also has to explain why the line appears to maintain order across a surface where random damage should break apart. The old tool story now has to survive a replication test. Experimental archaeology has already done important work here. Researchers and craftspeople have used copper tubes, sand, water, and human power to drill stone. The results matter. They show that a soft metal tube can open a hole in hard material when abrasive grains perform the actual cutting. They also show that slurry can leave marks more complex than a simple diagram would suggest. This is where the careful viewer has to resist an easy answer from either side. The experiment that cuts stone proves possibility. It does not automatically explain every ancient trace. The unusual groove on Petrie's core proves a problem. It does not automatically prove a modern machine. The truth is narrower and more demanding. Copper tube drilling can work. Quartz sand can bite. Emery or corundum-rich abrasive could bite harder. Slow rotation under steady pressure can produce a core. A hand-powered system can leave circular wear and irregular scoring. None of that needs to be denied. But the disputed mark is not asking whether ancient workers could drill at all. It is asking whether this line, with this apparent regularity and this apparent pitch, can be produced by the simple version of that process. That changes the argument. The old public debate often gets trapped in the wrong question. One side says copper is too soft. The other side answers that abrasive does the cutting. That answer is valid, but it does not close the case. Tool material is only one part of drilling. A drilling system also needs force. It needs alignment. It needs a way to keep the tube from wandering. It needs abrasive supply at the cutting edge. It needs waste to move out of the cut. It needs the operator to keep the motion stable while the stone resists. Each of those factors can be ordinary. Together, they form a control problem. That is why experiments can satisfy the broad model while leaving the Petrie groove under pressure. A replicated hole shows that the method is possible. A matched spiral would show that the specific trace is explained. Those are different burdens. If a modern test produces a slow hole with scattered scratches, it supports copper and abrasive. If it produces a continuous spiral with comparable pitch, comparable depth, and comparable regularity, it speaks directly to Petrie's mark. Without that match, the core remains uncomfortable. The core stops being a yes or no argument. It becomes a mechanical fingerprint. Imagine the analyst working with the old evidence on a modern screen. The stone itself is not in the room. What sits in front of the technician is a stack of images, historical drawings, published measurements, and close views of a surface that has been argued over for generations. The object is old. The question is older than the software. The first pass is simple. The workflow identifies visible lines. Some stop quickly. Some cross damaged areas. Some fade into noise. Those are tagged as uncertain because stone surfaces are never clean witnesses. Then one line keeps returning. It curves with the core. It reappears where the texture changes. It seems to continue after small interruptions where the eye might have treated the damage as a break. The analyst adjusts the overlay. The line still holds. The contrast changes. The line still follows the same path. That is the moment the room would get quiet. No one has proved a machine. No one has rewritten the Old Kingdom. But the mark has stopped behaving like a random scratch on a rough surface. It has become a candidate for continuity. The analyst reruns the comparison against known abrasive drilling marks. The system does not see only darkness and light. It follows direction, spacing, curvature, and relationship to the core's cylindrical form. It asks whether several broken visual pieces might belong to the same wrapped path. Human eyes are good at seeing patterns. They are also good at inventing them. That is why the automated review is useful. It can be made to test continuity without caring whether the result is convenient. The hidden payoff is not that a computer noticed magic. It noticed alignment across damage. That is exactly the kind of thing a person might miss for honest reasons. A 19th century drawing simplifies. A photograph flattens stone. A museum label compresses the dispute into a sentence. A specialist looking for broad tool categories may not chase one groove around the whole surface. The system can. It does not get tired. It does not prefer the textbook. It does not prefer the forbidden answer. It follows the line. And once the groove is treated as a continuous trace, the hidden mechanism becomes the real dispute. Tube drilling is simple to picture and difficult to perfect. A hollow tube spins against stone. Abrasive grains sit under the rim. As pressure increases, some grains bite into the stone surface, others roll, crush, or wash away. Water keeps the slurry moving, but too much water can carry grit away from the cutting edge. Too little can clog the cut. Inside the tube, the core remains standing. The tool is cutting a ring around it. As the ring deepens, the tube must remain aligned. If the tube wobbles, the hole widens unevenly. If pressure changes, the bite changes. If abrasive supply falters, the cut slows. If waste builds up, the tool rides on mud instead of cutting. Copper adds another complication. It can deform. That can be useful because the rim may hold abrasive grains. It can also be a problem because a distorted rim may chatter, drag, or lose its clean circle. The line between controlled cutting and rough grinding is thin. Now add the spiral. A spiral feed mark means the surface is recording the relationship between rotation and descent. With every turn, the tool advances. The mark wraps because the contact point moves around while the cut deepens. The pitch becomes a clue to feed control. In a slow hand process, the pitch should be modest and irregular unless the operators maintain remarkably steady conditions. That does not make it impossible. It makes it demanding. The abrasive matters. Quartz can cut, but it wears and crushes. Emery or corundum-rich material would change the behavior because harder grains can bite more aggressively. The pressure matters because grains need force to plow into stone. Rotation stability matters because an uneven tube creates chatter instead of a clean, repeated path. Tool chatter can also make patterns. A vibrating tube may leave rhythmic marks that look ordered without requiring a modern machine. That is why caution matters. A repeated mechanical signature does not automatically reveal its exact cause. It may record feed. It may record vibration. It may record a combination of pressure changes and abrasive pulses. The scan cannot prove a powered machine. It can separate random surface damage from a repeated mechanical signature. That distinction is enough to make the old answer work harder. If the mark is random, the argument relaxes. If it is a chatter line, the model has to explain the vibration pattern. If it is a feed line, the model has to explain how a copper tube, loose abrasive, and human control produced that advance in hard stone. Each option keeps the discussion inside evidence. No legends are needed. No insult to ancient skill is needed. The core asks a mechanical question with a stone surface. A regular spiral raises questions about pressure, abrasive supply, rotation stability, and feed control, because those are the things a spiral would record. It is not the copper alone, it is the whole system. And if the same pressure appears elsewhere in Egyptian stonework, the core is not a lonely anomaly. The drill core belongs to a wider family of marks. Across Egyptian hard stonework, the same broad tool questions return. Drilled sarcophagi, boreholes, stone vessels, saw cuts in granite, smooth surfaces around Giza and other pyramid-era monuments, circular openings where a tubular tool seems likely, kerfs where abrasive sawing is accepted, but the rate and control remain debated. The responsible way to look at this evidence is not to throw all of it into one dramatic pile. Different marks can have different causes. A saw kerf is not a drill core. A vessel interior is not a sarcophagus lid. A granite block face is not a diorite bowl. But recurring traces can pressure the same explanation from different sides. Abrasive methods can account for much of the work. That is important. The ancient Egyptians did not need hidden steel to shape every hard object. Skilled labor, specialized tools, organized workshops, and long experience can produce results that look impossible to modern eyes because modern viewers underestimate patience. Still, patience is not a universal solvent. When a mark implies efficiency, steadiness, or unusually aggressive cutting, the model has to account for more than time. It has to account for process control. That is why Petrie's core remains valuable. It is a small object connected to a large question. It sits between two exaggerated answers. One says the textbook has explained everything. The other says the presence of a spiral proves lost modern machinery. The stone does not need either extreme. It needs a better explanation of the mark. Look at saw cuts. In abrasive sawing, sand or harder grit can be drawn beneath a blade. The cut can deepen as the tool moves back and forth. The theory is sound. But where kerfs show unusual straightness, depth, or surface character, the question becomes more specific. What abrasive? What pressure? What guide? What rhythm? What labor arrangement? Look at drilled holes. A tubular drill can produce them, but if the walls show repeating marks, the marks become data. They can speak to wobble, feed, and abrasive behavior. Look at stone vessels. Some interiors show tight curves and clean forms. They do not prove a factory. They do prove a level of tool control that deserves precise study. Institutions often answer the broad question while leaving the specific mark underexplained. They say copper and abrasive can cut stone. That is a useful answer. But Petrie's spiral asks for the exact operating conditions that made that groove. The strongest reveal is not that copper failed everywhere. It is that one old groove forces the model to become much more complicated. The automated review changes the dispute because it changes the center of gravity. For years, the argument has been staged as copper against stone. Copper is soft, granite is hard. Therefore, one side says the official story fails. The other side answers that sand does the cutting. Therefore, the official story survives. Petrie's spiral moves the fight away from that simple frame. The issue is tool control. If the AI is right to flag the groove as a structured machining trace, then the simple copper tube and sand story cannot absorb it without extra assumptions. The model needs abrasive of the right hardness and supply. It needs enough downward pressure to make the grains bite. It needs rotation stable enough to keep the mark coherent. It needs feed control good enough to explain the pitch. Those assumptions may be possible. They may even be ancient, but they are no longer the easy version of the story. That is the title promise. One spiral mark breaks the easy tool story because it forces the explanation to carry speed, pressure, stability, and control, not only material. The AI did not declare a lost modern machine at Giza. It did not prove electricity, steel, or a vanished industrial civilization. That would be a larger claim than the evidence can hold. But it did validate the pressure point Petrie left behind. It showed why the old evidence still matters. The mark is physical. It is measurable. It can be traced. It can be compared. It can be argued over without turning the whole subject into fantasy. That is why the core survives both dismissal and exaggeration. To the skeptic of lost technology, the core says, explain the line, not only the tool category. To the believer in a hidden ancient method, the core says, the mark is not enough unless the mechanism can be described. Both sides are forced back to the object. That is where evidence belongs. The automated review notices what a compressed textbook paragraph tends to flatten. It sees that the controversial feature is not merely a scratch. It is a possible sequence. If that sequence reflects feed, the ancient drilling system was more controlled than the simple classroom version suggests. If it reflects chatter, the tool behavior was still more complex than a clean copper and sand diagram implies. Either way, the old answer has to become more exact. That is the largest implication. Not that history collapses in one scan, but that a famous piece of Egyptian evidence still refuses to fit the easiest explanation. Petrie documented it before the modern culture war around ancient technology. The stone carried it before Petrie. The spiral remains after both. The opening proof object returns unchanged. A drill core, a groove, a question wrapped around stone. And the record is still not fully unsealed. The drill core is a surviving witness. It does not speak in legends. It speaks in stone, spiral, pressure, and measurement. The accepted story can still defend copper, sand, water, and patient work. But the spiral asks whether that defense has been drawn too simply. That is the unresolved record. So where do you land? Is Petrie's mark an overread of abrasive scratches, evidence of a forgotten Egyptian drilling method, or proof that the textbook explanation was built too simply? Leave your theory in the comments and subscribe for the next hidden record, the next scan, or the next recovered object that forces an old answer back under the light. The spiral is still there.